So, Joe made a response to me again, and I'm going to address some of his points here. This is going to be a very simple video with very little editing because honestly, I want to spend more time on my Proving Christianity video series. Joe first criticizes my position in the following way. The paper is explicitly concerned only with the persistence and existence of concrete objects. This says absolutely nothing about various properties that some concrete objects may have by way of participation. TD has failed to provide an example of concrete objects that persist in existence only due to external concurrent efficient causal substance. But this is precisely what he would need to provide in order to provide a counterexample. Hence his alleged counterexample fails. A towel's wetness is not the persistence and existence of a concrete object. I think technically this is fair as far as he technically does use the word concrete objects, and there is a distinction between properties and objects in analytic philosophy. That said, my argument wasn't really about properties. It was about participation relations. And the reason for this is because Thomists hold that things which exist do so because they participate in God's essence. St. Thomas Aquinas' fourth way, at least according to North Clarke's interpretation, is basically following along these lines. So I don't think he can just dismiss the fact that participation relations need a concurrent sustaining cause in order for them to exist, simply because the example that I gave happened to be of something which is a property, because that's not really the point. I mean, if there are these participation relations between God and creatures, it's not the case that the participation relations are significantly different merely because they're not properties. There's no reason to think that. There's good reason to think that if there's this sort of participation relation, it would also have to exist here and now. He next argues in the following way. Socrates' rationality is not an external, concurrent, efficient, sustaining cause of Socrates. It's just an essential property. Yes, things would not exist if their essential properties didn't exist, but this is an external, efficient, sustaining cause of them. The paper, I'm going to be saying paper instead of IJPR because it's easier, is perfectly compatible with things having essential properties, since the paper doesn't deny the dependence of things on their essential properties. Hence TD's claim that a counterexample is false. So if Joe wants to hold the existential inertia thesis only applies to external concurrent efficient sustaining causes, that's fine, but I didn't take his paper to be saying that, really. First of all, because he didn't explicitly say anything about that in the paper. He didn't mention that he was talking about only external efficient concurrent sustaining causes, and I think he even admitted that in his response to me. Furthermore, he specifically responded to Edward Feser's objection to existential inertia in terms of parts and whole dependency, which would be an internal material causal relation. If he were only talking about external efficient causes, then why did he not just respond to Feser's argument by saying that, oh well, I'm only talking about external efficient causes, not internal material causes. Maybe that's just a decision he made, but you can see why I wouldn't get from Joe arguing that an internal material cause of the existence of things, that he only has a problem with external efficient causes sustaining things. That's just not what I got. But maybe that's what he meant. But I think at least You can see where I'm coming from here. So he next says, so I'm not sure what existing in some sense means, but we can set this aside. I don't think you should just dismiss it, because this is specifically something Edward Feser says in his discussion of the water, hydrogen, and oxygen in Aristotle's Revenge. The Thomistic interpretation of hylomorphism insists on the doctrine of the unicity of substantial form, according to which a substance only has one substantial form. Notice the claim is not that hydrogen and oxygen don't exist in water at all. It is rather that they don't exist in water in the way that they exist when they exist on their own. Consider that if oxygen and hydrogen were actually present in the water, they should possess all of their characteristic properties and powers. That means that we should be able to burn the hydrogen and boil the oxygen at negative 183 degrees Celsius. But we cannot do either. Hence, the substantial forms of oxygen and hydrogen cannot be present, in which case the substance hydrogen and oxygen cannot be present. So all Feser is arguing here is that things do not have more than one substantial form. In this example, that they don't have the form of water and the form of hydrogen and oxygen at the same time. That doesn't mean that what were hydrogen and oxygen are not distinct in any sense. In other words, if you watched hydrogen and oxygen come together to form water in a scanning electron microscope, Feser isn't claiming that the chunk of matter, which is hydrogen, is no longer distinct in the sense that they occupy different spatial locations, have different sizes, number of electrons, etc. He isn't claiming the typical structural diagram of water is completely incorrect. Rather, he is merely claiming that hydrogen and oxygen no longer exist there in the sense that they don't have the natural ends of hydrogen and oxygen, and hence don't have the form which directs things to their ends. The way Roland explains this here is helpful. Now, while there may be no structural difference between a bound hydrogen atom and a free one, in terms of form and matter, there is a substantial difference, pun intended. The bound hydrogen atom exists and is structured as part of the water molecule's form, whereas the free hydrogen atom exists and is structured by its own form. The free hydrogen atom's form excludes all sorts of things that are included in by the water molecule's form, not the least of which are the structures and of the oxygen atoms. Of course, the two are not completely unrelated, since the form of the water molecule in some sense contains the form of the hydrogen atom. This is what we're getting at when we say the hydrogen exists virtually within the water, even though the water molecule has only one substantial form. Its form is multifaceted. So it isn't that there are no actually distinct parts in water, it's just that those distinct parts are unified by one substantial form with a unified natural end. In other words, it's true that the potential substantial form of hydrogen isn't actual, and hence it doesn't cause water through its ability to burn, say, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a structural sense of hydrogen existing actually in the water. Hence, Thomists are not going to deny that we can model how different structural parts of the water, what is typically called hydrogen and oxygen, would physically interact with each other. And those structural parts do actualize things. Likewise, it doesn't follow that just because the parts of the water are not actual as hydrogen and oxygen, that they cannot actualize the existence of wholes, since they are actual in some respect. The reason I've given this claim a rating of irrelevant is that it's simply irrelevant to the criticism that I raised in the paper concerning the virtuality and hence non-actuality of parts. The causal principle Phaser adduces doesn't say that what reduces from potency to act is actualized by something in the state of actuality in a sense, but potency in another sense. Rather, Phaser's causal principle says that what reduces from potency to act is actualized by something in the state of actuality. Simpliciter, full stop. But St. Thomas Aquinas says in his first way that things can be actual in some respect, but potential in other respects. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potency in the same respect, but only in different respects. The coffee, for example, may be only potentially cold, but Phaser doesn't say that that's all there is to it. He says it's actually hot. So it's actual in a sense, but potential in a sense. Similarly, the coffee may only be potentially cold, but actually wet. They are actual and potential in different respects, and Phaser isn't arguing that heat or wetness of the coffee cannot actualize anything because it's potentially cold. That would be absurd. Phaser isn't saying the hydrogen and oxygen do not exist actually in any respect, just that they don't exist in water in the way that they exist when they exist on their own. In other words, they don't exist as actually having the substantial form of hydrogen and oxygen, but they do actually have things like the structure mentioned in Roland's blog. So that particular actuality can actualize potentials, while of course the potential substantial form of hydrogen and oxygen cannot act through burning, for example. And by the way, I just realized he said that he doesn't he wasn't talking about properties, so referring to properties is not a good counterexample. Why didn't he say that about Phaser's hot coffee? Is heat not a property of coffee? Anyway, he continues in this way. I agree that if I were trying to object to the Thomistic account, then my criticism would be based on an underlying misunderstanding, but I wasn't trying to object to the Thomistic account. Instead, I was merely sketching some prima facie, rationally defensible and plausible accounts that pinpoints that in virtue of which inertial persistence obtains. I'm not really sure where this is coming from. In the paper, Joe specifically says he's responding to Phaser, a Thomist, on his view that actuality must be actualized by a concurrent, sustaining cause of its existence. If he isn't responding to the Thomistic view of concurrence, which isn't anything like the claim that causes must have the same time property, then he isn't responding to Phaser's view at all. Again, if Phaser were claiming that a sustaining actualizer had to exist at the same time as the effect in terms of possessing the property T1 or being limited to time 1, then it would follow that God could not be a sustaining actualizer. But this is obviously not what Phaser thinks. Rather, I think it is better to think of Phaser's claim as being that things which exist here and now depend on something else for its existence. Not that the cause has to exist here and now, except in the sense that it is causing the effect here and now. It's not that the thing that exists here and now exists because something has these properties of time here and now, blah, 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 blah. It's because it's that they depend here and now on that thing that exists. Saying that a past event is causing an effect here now doesn't really refute the claim, because Phaser's claim is not that things which are limited to T1 or do not have the property T1, like God, cannot be a sustaining cause. Of course, Phaser doesn't think that past things can cause future things since he's a presentist, but it isn't because he thinks causes have to have the same time properties. There can be something that distinguishes present things from nothing. The present fact about them, that they were/are caused or otherwise explained by something immediately temporally prior. This clearly differentiates them from utter non-being or nothingness, since it is clearly false to say that it is a present fact about utter non-being/nothingness that it was/is caused or otherwise explained by something immediately temporally prior. I agree that there is a sense in which past things and our causal relations to those past things are real. I mean, it is really the case that Abraham Lincoln existed, for example, but Phaser at least isn't going to want to say that the fact exists in the same sense that the present things exist. We needn't cash out claims about what was the case in terms of some claim about what presently is the case, or in terms of something, a property or whatever that exists now. Facts about what was are as primitive as acts about what is, and irreducible to the latter. The whole point of presentism, after all, is that the past and future don't have the kind of reality that the present does. Hence, it shouldn't be surprising if the truth makers for statements about past and future are unlike truth makers for statements about the present. The causal relations between past events and the current events also cannot really be said to exist in the same sense that current things exist. So what exactly makes Joe think that things which are real in a different sense than present things are real can differentiate present things from nothing? Why do I think they cannot, though? Well, the primary reason has to do with what I think about what existence is like. If you ask yourself, how do you know something exists? It's ultimately going to be because you can sense it, or you can sense something that it acts on. We wouldn't believe something exists because it acts on us unless there were some sort of relation between activity and existence. And so one way I describe existence is as a principle of action. In other words, existence can be defined as that which is necessary for things to act. In Norris Clarke's book, The One and the Many, he uses this reading to argue that existence is dynamic rather than merely static. It is through action, and only through action, that real beings manifest or unveil their being, their presence to each other and to me. All the beings that make up the world of my experience thus reveal themselves as not just presence standing out of nothingness, but actively presenting themselves to others, and vice versa, by interacting with each other. Meditating on this leads us to the metaphysical conclusion that it is the very nature of real being, existential being, to pour over into action that is self-revealing and self-communicative. In a word, existential being is intrinsically dynamic, not static. Given that sort of background, the primary difference in my view between things that once existed and now no longer exist is that they do not have this active dynamism. They don't have the principle of activity, so they cannot give it by participation to things which exist now. This is why I say that there may be a sense in which past things are real, but it isn't in this Abraham Lincoln directly acting on a sense. Past things don't exist in the sense Abraham Lincoln has the principle by which he can give us a speech right now. If presentism is false, then Abraham Lincoln has the power, but limited to his time, and that's what makes it true to say that he no longer exists now. I understand that Joe probably disagrees with this view of existence and time, but I'm just trying to explain here why Thomists are thinking in terms that they do. Why they think there must be a cause that exists here and now, in the sense that they are self-revealing and self-communicative now. Because being self-revealing and self-communicative means that they have the principle of action, which is just what we mean by existence. He continues in this way. My paper solely concerns the Aristotelian proof, and Phaser himself recognizes existential inertia directly challenges a premise of this proof, and doesn't misunderstand the premise of or proofs at all. I don't know how TD is able to get away with these kind of claims. What I was talking about specifically was that Joe seems to misunderstand what premise 7 means by the concurrent actualization of S's potential. The claim is not that the actualizer of S's potential must have the same time property as S or anything like that. It doesn't even say that in the premise. Again, that would rule out God as the sustaining cause. His next criticism is as follows. Here I am not saying that the divine conservationist just asserts something is metaphysically necessary. Rather, I'm doing theory comparison. Both theories, existential inertia and divine conservation, hit a primitive, i.e. not further explained, metaphysically necessary bedrock. Okay, I think saying that it's just an arbitrary assertion may be a bit of a mischaracterization, but let me explain where I'm coming from. Here's the thing. I don't believe that saying it is metaphysically necessary that this is the case is a real meaningful answer to the question of why anything is the case. It is very similar to saying that X is the case just because, or because it's a brute fact. It's a non-intelligible answer on its own, which is why I see it as baseless. There's nothing grounding the intelligibility of the statement. Imagine, for example, a detective explaining why a crime happened by saying it was necessary that the crime happened. I mean, it may be true that the crime necessarily happened, and maybe that's why it happened, but if it did, it happened because of a certain underlying truth, such as the motives of those involved. Saying that it happened because it was necessary is a true answer to the question of why the crime happened, but it isn't a meaningful answer in the same way that explaining the motives of those involved in the crime would be meaningful. So when you characterize these theists as saying God is pure act because it's metaphysically necessary that this is the case, I think this is similarly non-informative. It may be true that it is metaphysically necessary that God is pure act, but that doesn't make it the answer meaningful. And it isn't generally how Thomists go about answering the question anyway. This is why comparing the theistic view that God is pure act simply because it is metaphysically necessary to existential inertia as something that is the case simply because it's metaphysically necessary isn't a fair comparison. The theist has a view that has an actual meaningful explanation as to why it's metaphysically necessary. But how can you have a meaningful explanation, you might ask, if God is not explained in terms of anything prior to himself? The answer is that Thomists do not think that the ultimate cause of what makes something meaningful is something prior to a thing. What makes an answer meaningful in the Thomistic model is real being, as St. Thomas Aquinas says. Now, everything insofar as it has beings, so far is it knowable. Wherefore, it is said in the De Anima that the soul is in some manner all things, through the senses and the intellect. And where, therefore, as good is convertible with being, so is the true. But as the good adds to the being the notion of desirable, the true adds relation to the intellect. This is why the discussion of how we immediately grasp the meaning of being and how one grounds God's metaphysical necessity in being is so important. If I have a view of the metaphysical ground of all things, or something that's metaphysically basic, but my view is actually intelligible, and your view is not intelligible, it can't be further explained, as you put it, then my view is clearly superior. And comparing the two is really not a fair comparison, especially when you're misrepresenting. I know it's unintentional, but misrepresenting how we go about talking about why God is purely actual. Now, Joe does talk about self-explanatory truths in his paper, and this is somewhat similar to what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being as intelligible in itself, but he puts it in terms of the very impossibility of the failure of its failure to obtain, which again I think is not really meaningful. And this is why I'm not taking his view as a significant alternative to the theistic model. Thanks for watching.